All right, we are now live for another political theory and practice discussion. And I delayed it this month to this date because I wanted to get past the inauguration. I knew that there was going to be some, contestation going on. I was kind of surprised actually at the sort that we ended up having. And so I wanted to see how things settled out before talking about anything and determining the topic that we would discuss this month. And so I settled on this discussion primarily centering around unity and accountability, but also conflict, and we could call it pluralism or how to carry out politics in the broad sense, not just in the sense of like getting people elected or maneuvering power, but politics in a really much more meaningful sense that I'll talk about in just a bit. So since the election, what we've seen is a number of attempts to say that the election was illegitimate in this way or this way or this way, many of which are completely self-serving because a lot of the Republicans who've been raising these issues didn't question whether their own elections were legitimate or illegitimate, just the presidential one, and perhaps some of their opponents who made it through. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there, and we saw, in this month, essentially an attempt, and we're not even sure exactly how far it goes. There's more and more coming out about the picture of just how pervasive some of this stuff was. There was an attempt at an insurrection or a coup. There's a lot of problems with the way in which we're doing politics at this point in time. The F word, fascist, has been thrown around quite a lot, and I think at this point in time it is actually deserved of a number of different agents, people, movements, forces within our society. So we're in kind of a mess, and what I want to do in this session is talk about some of these issues of the day and what's going on with them. I'm also going to address, and answer questions and comments. And I want to frame it in terms of some ideas, or let's call them conceptions, from classical political theory, and also, running into, the 20th century with people like, say, Hannah Arendt or Jürgen Habermas, that can be quite helpful. So I want to remind everybody, let's be civil as best as we can with each other. This is not a talking head, MSNBC or Fox News sort of like throw out bullet points kind of framework that we're doing here. We're looking to talk thoughtfully about what's actually going on in terms of politics. And for those of you who are, foreign viewers, non-Americans, not from the United States of America, and I don't want to offend other people from the Americas as well, because America is more than just the USA in many respects. Some of this may seem particularly U.S. centric, and that's just going to be the way that it is, because that's really what's on my mind, living here in a swing state. Where some of the election stuff actually did get challenged, and then the challenges were thrown out, and where we have a sitting senator who is part of the, sort of essentially broad conspiracy to do this stuff, who hopefully will get recalled or thrown out pretty soon, since he's such an embarrassment to our state. So, it is going to turn on this. I think some of the implications are be applicable to other countries in the present as well. And let's start at the beginning, right? We had an election, and it was a very hotly contested election. It was carried out under extraordinary circumstances due to the pandemic that we're still in the middle of, which has become incredibly politicized. It probably shouldn't have become so, but due to the incompetence and corruption of the Trump administration, it was from the very beginning. And Trump himself did a lot of damage as a figure who held things back or interfered in the wrong ways, and then people in his administration did as well. And then we can look across, our federalized country where local control is very important, and see how some places handled the pandemic response well, others didn't. And, Wisconsin is a prime example. We still have Republicans right now trying to knock down a mask mandate, So there's the COVID itself became a hot button political issue. It drove a lot of things with the election. There were a lot of debates about, could you mail in ballots or things like that? A good bit of misinformation out there. We've always had the usual attempts at voter suppression on the part of the Republicans. There's sometimes some voter suppression on the part of the Democrats as well, but primarily it's the Republicans trying to keep people that they think they don't want voting from being able to vote. We're kind of an unusual country in the way that we do elections, both in that we have so many local laws that make it difficult for people to vote, and we also allow these election campaigns to go on and on forever, and for tons and tons of money, much of which is coming from corporations or from political action committees or things like that, to be funneled into our politics. So we had a messed up election, right? What was unusual about this, although not totally unusual, but it reached a much higher level of screwed upness, politically speaking, is the contestation of the election. So right now, there's a lot of people trying to play equivalency games and say, Democrats were saying, not my president after Trump got elected. And they were wearing the Women's March and, saying all sorts of mean things about Trump and blah, 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 right? It wasn't at that wasn't to the degree that what happened after this election reached. We can say similar things about Bush versus Gore, right? I remember when that election took place, and I remember actually sitting in a cafe in Carbondale, which was pretty liberal at the time, and having a waitress come up and seeing me reading The Economist, and talking about the election. Then she blurted in there, he's not my president, and I was like, I didn't ask you, right? Why don't you get me my stuff? And so this sentiment has been around for a long time. Republicans did that with Clinton. They also did that en masse with Obama. That's when we started to see the Republican Party really metastasizing with the Tea Party. And we'll talk about that movement in just a bit. But the refusal to concede and the bringing tons and tons of frivolous lawsuits that they knew were frivolous as they were doing, and the calling for an insurrection, which was not new to Trump. Remember the Liberate Michigan thing that led to the Michigan governor not only the people going into the state house fully armed. They should have been cracked down on immediately, particularly given the long history of militia movements in Michigan. But of course they weren't, because we had people who were receptive to that in power. But then an actual plot to kidnap her, spurred in part because of what Trump was promoting. So this is, fortunately, it was a failed coup. But there was arguably a coup that took place here. And so this sort of sour grapes, we're not going to work with you unless you do everything our way attitude is very problematic. Now, one could say, well, the Democrats have done that sort of stuff. Look at them, under Reconstruction time in the South. And yeah, that's a different party, actually. I mean, the people who are in the Democrat Party at that time are now staunch Republican types. So this is a significant issue that we're facing. And politics, so, okay, we've got that going on. Politics is always messy. You don't have real politics with everybody being on the same page. There has to be some, different interests being represented and having to work things out with each other. And it's usually not to everybody's benefit, and not everybody's happy with it, and they can grouse about it and bitch about it and say that the other side are bad people. But in general, if you want to have a functioning political system, there have to be some basic norms that are being observed and honored. And one of those is you don't rise up against the government itself unless you get some pretty damn good reasons to do so. And there weren't any in this case. The stop the steal stuff is all bullshit, and it's been revealed as such. And it's difficult as like an independent observer who is a virtue ethicist and devoted to the life of reason, and is also very realistic about politics, to take those people seriously. But we have to, because there's so many of them now, right? And so here's where we get to the unity thing. So now that we've made it past we made it past all these challenges and the inauguration and an attempted coup and all that, and Trump has flown away, although there's still more stuff going on in the background with Trump and the possibility of the Republican Party itself having an internal chaos and split, which we'll hopefully talk about a little bit later. There's this call for having unity, and a call to like understand the other side who lost. And, in general, I would be quite receptive to those sorts of things, because that is what, classical political philosophy would generally counsel if you were dealing with people who were not as corrupt, as power hungry, as deliberately oppositional as the Republican Party has shown itself to be, and their base has shown itself to be. And if you didn't have, I'm just going to say, whack job movements like QAnon or the gun nuttery stuff going on that always appeals to a Second Amendment and never has a well-regulated militia, just a bunch of losers who, want to spend their money on guns, depriving their family of money that could be used for other things, and then go around, fully armed, intimidating people. And we could, anti-COVID stuff, all of these sorts of things that became mainstream. Truthism, that became a big thing with Obama, and Trump was at the center of that. He appealed to that. The Tea Party was in large part about that sort of stuff. And I got to see the Tea Party emerge. I was actually in North Carolina at the time, and we were having some very interesting discussions in our departments about what this new phenomenon actually was. So can you actually work with people like that? Can you have unity with people who are clearly devoted to doing whatever they can to make sure they remain in power or can obstruct whatever is going on? Wisconsin is a prime example. We are one of the most gerrymandered states in the United States. We have all sorts of people who would not be able to have a seat in Congress if districts were drawn properly. But that's something that's been going on. And so we have a state where Republicans dominate, even though they are a minority in the state, and they'll do anything they can, voter suppression, continuing gerrymandering, bringing all sorts of lawsuits in order to hold on to power. Can you deal with somebody who doesn't deal in good faith? Then the answer is no. So these calls for unity, which are coming not just from people on the right, but also from people in the center and from some people on the left, I think they're misguided. I think at this point in time, and I'm going to put forth a strong thesis here as somebody who is not committed to either party, but right now sees the Republican Party as particularly bad. I think that unless the Republicans want to do a little bit more than just mea culpa, oh, it was bad, and they want to put their money where their mouth is and take hard stands and say, this aspect was wrong and we need to change this. The things that we've done to appeal to our base and to further radicalize our base in terms of, race or culture war stuff or tendentious, use of biblical stuff that's totally anti-Christian, totally against any real interpretation of Christianity that focuses on the Sermon on the Mount or cares about that Jesus guy and what he stood for. Unless they're actually going to come clean and say, holy crap, did we screw up? I don't know how we let things get to this fever swamp that the Tea Party and the Trumpist movement turned into, but we got to change this. And there are Republicans like that, right? Some of them left the party, like the mayor of Waukesha. If you don't know what Waukesha is, look it up on the map. Waukesha County is essentially the Republican capital of the state of Wisconsin. And, it's a hotbed for all the conservative stuff. The mayor, who was a Republican, said, "You guys are so nuts, I can't deal with you anymore." And, we have another personality here in Wisconsin, Charlie Sykes, who has a long, bad past of being like a hardcore racist and race baiting in the Milwaukee area. But he became a never Trumper and stuck with it. And he's evolved, not far enough, but he's evolved since then. Unless the Republicans are going to do that sort of thing, I don't think that they deserve a seat at the table. Or if they do get a seat at the table, they have to be understood as only serving themselves, only serving the people that they represent, or corporations, or PACs, or Koch brothers, whoever. And they don't deserve to be treated as, colleagues or anything like that. The Democrats, in my view, need to really play hardball. All this talk about, we're one nation and we can all come together, that's actually marginalizing the people who've been so screwed over, and not just by the Trump administration, also by the Obama administration, also by the Bush administration, also by the Clinton administration. We go a long ways back, right? All the way back to, my childhood and the Reagan administration. Unless we're going to actually acknowledge the people who've been victimized and marginalized and who've had their votes taken away, I don't want to hear about how some, Trump person feels bad about something. Screw them. They were the party of screw your feelings, right? Feelings, we have facts, trump feelings. Well, they don't get to have it both ways. And so, is this what the Biden administration is actually going to do? Probably not. The Biden administration is going to be pretty center left. Most of the people who want to see things that are associated with the left, but are actually just good common sense, like virtue ethics, classical politics, make things for the common good, like, say, universal health care, or, a much fairer economic landscape that doesn't allow all these predatory things to be done to ordinary people, and reins in the corporations. That's not going to have much of a role, I think, in the Biden administration, unless we really push for it. And that's part of what I intend to do. And we have to be very realistic about the fact that not a lot of this is going to come through. But it's still better than having an arguably, actually essentially, fascist regime in power. It's not great, but it's certainly better. Now, classical political theory would say that you cannot have fair dealings between those who won't act, at least in some good faith. And now, what's important about that? It means that it's not just about looking at the other person across the table or their constituents and saying, you matter too, you're also a person, I'm going to treat you according to certain norms. It does have to do with unity. You say the unity of our political community and its common good trumps my programs, trumps my constituents, not entirely, but I do have to at least acknowledge that and take that into account. And that is part of what has been lost on the Republican side, and lost now for, I would say, about 10 years. The Tea Party clearly lost it. The Tea Party came out of a politics of resentment and culture war stuff that was going on, and effectively took over the Republican Party. The Trump movement just metastasized that further. Things like QAnon, have made it worse in other ways as well. And they've bred a whole group of people who think that they are the ones who are victimized. They're the ones who are, they're the ones who are threatened and all that. And how do you deal with people like that? Well, that's a big issue, a big problem. Now, people like Aristotle or Augustine or Hannah Arendt would say that there is nothing that says that any given political community has to be able to remain in existence. And this is where our American exceptionalism so often gets us into trouble. So American exceptionalism is this view that somehow like we're different than the norm, and we've got the thing to get us through. And it's not the case. We're no different than any other polity in the world, other than the particularities of our history and ideologies, and the fact that we happen to be the #1 economy for the present, which is not going to last for our lifetimes, and the fact that we've got military force all over the world, which we pay an awful high premium for. If we don't get it together, if we don't figure out how to effectively deal with the fact that a significant part of the population was cool with an attack on the electoral process and the capital, and we don't find some ways to either marginalize them and keep them out of the political process. There's many of them who are in the Republican leadership right now. Maybe we need something like a cordon sanitaire, like they had to make sure that fascist parties couldn't get into power, but we need to do it with individuals and their declared things. We may not continue on as a political community, and we are facing a lot of challenges, and we are facing some significant rivals, both political and economic. So, are the Democrats a model at this point in time for like getting it right? I wouldn't say yes. But they're all that we have to work with, because we have this stupid two-party system. And the one other party is clearly so screwed up and corrupt and power hungry and has a base that and leadership that believes in all sorts of, frankly, crazy and cruel stuff. So it's going to take a lot of people coming together, and it's going to be an iterative process. And I'm kind of hopeful about engaging in it, but it can also be draining. And for some people, it's probably going to be dangerous as well. Let's scroll up and take a look at some of these comments. So Good or Grown says, doesn't it feel like the fascism versus neoliberalism showdown was show put on by the corporations, or was there a real showdown? I think that's not the way to look at it. If you do look at it that way, then you can be a cynic and say, oh, it's all just for show, man, nothing going on. And there may be some aspect of that, but I don't think that's the explanation for things. Hasib says, please make a playlist on political science. Well, when I get to a certain level of Patreon support, I've pledged to do that. But that takes time and that takes money, right? Wavy says, I always enjoy these types of streams. Oh, good. Mr. Big Weekney, is there any historical precedent to the distortion of Trump's true character among his supporters? Oh, that's an interesting question. People thinking a 70-year-old scammer born into wealth is some made tough guy. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of precedents of people who have been, clearly in the reality of who they are, very different than the public image that they attempt to project and that other people circulate around about them. And this is a significant thing with the Trump thing. And that's actually a great point. You look at these people who make memes that have Trump with a it doesn't even have to be like a really buff body, just a decent body. The guy is a shambles because he eats crap all the time and he doesn't exercise, and he's got, by the way, crazy beliefs about exercise. that should have, come to light, and people should have been like, this guy's a nutter, and they think that he's a representation of masculinity. If I'll just say this: if you think that Trump is a guy's guy, you're there's something wrong with you, And I've heard it said that Trump is sort of like the stupid person's view of what an intelligent person is like. He is stupid. I mean, he's stupid on a number of different ways, right? He can't concentrate enough to read memos. He says stupid things like maybe we inject bleach or something like that, just off the cuff. He has very little sense, and he's been extraordinarily lucky to get away with as much bullshit as he has. And I think it's because people have enabled him over and over and over again. So this is actually a great question. I mean, anybody who gets into those memes or Ben Garrison cartoons or things like that. Now, on the one hand, they're probably not watching this, and if you're dealing with people like that, they're probably at this point not directly reachable. But you can see that there's a kind of nuttery or insanity going on. All right. Bark Lord says, I have an uncle who served in the Navy for 35 years. He believes people shouldn't vote unless they have property. Well, he's got an interesting point of view that we left behind, at least in this nation, more than a century ago. So he's kind of a throwback in that sense, I guess. I don't see why it's relevant that he served in the Navy for 35 years. Plenty of vets are, well put together, intelligent people who can have sensible political discussions. It must be interesting talking with him about stuff like that. Now, I will say a lot of my family, because I come from the Midwest, and many of my family live in the suburbs or in the countryside. Quite a few of them are really into their guns. A number of them are Trump supporters. Some of them are QAnon believers. It is kind of difficult when you have to try to deal with these people. Fortunately, COVID has meant that, we don't have to go to family things anymore. All right. Wavy says, what do you think about the satirical remarks made against different schools of philosophy in Voltaire's Candide? They're fun, but that's about it. All right. SN Project, wouldn't it be more clear in this discussion not to refer to the two parties in the U.S. as Republican or Democrat, but conservative or liberal? No. The Republican Party is not remotely conservative in any real sense of the term. Used to be that conservatives were pro-gun control. Now the NRA, even bankrupt, runs the show. That's not conservative. That's just nutty, right? Used to be that conservatives actually wanted to protect the environment. So-called conservatives in the present wanted, monetize it as much as possible, and then let everybody else live in the crap. So no, that's silly. The parties are called what they're called. I mean, you can try to propose that people adopt the vocabulary that you want. People do this all the time in philosophy, by the way. Let's see if you can actually get that to work. And liberal, the Democratic Party is not all that liberal. And it all depends on what you mean by liberal too. There's people that are like, oh, I'm a classical liberal. A lot of those are Republicans, or they're libertarians who end up, effectively voting Republican anyway. So no, I think it's kind of a non-starter. Barklord, my American patriot family explicitly reject democratic process. Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because if they really were patriots in America, then they would be for the democratic process. And insofar as they're not, they're more, you could call them fascists, or maybe they're like integral nationalists, or they're just for a military junta or something like that, or they're just for oligarchs running things. But they're not patriots, because this nation very explicitly was about consensus, democratic process, all those sorts of things. That's part of our experiment. That's why Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, right? He didn't call it oligarchy in America or something like that. So that's a good thing to to think about. All right. Another view, all the reading needs to be put to test of the forced narrative. I don't really know what that means. Let's scroll down a little bit more. Barklord, neoliberals are in favor of government facilitating capitalist interests. Neoconservatives also favor conservative social policies. You know, these categories of neoliberal, neoconservatives got a little bit more, let's say, definite contours to it. Neoliberal is like the word fascist, right? There's ways in which it comes out of particular theories, and if you're going to use it in that way, you got to be kind of careful about how you apply it, or else everything turns into neoliberalism. And then there's the just use of it as a slur, when Trump first got elected, I was like, you people that are calling him a fascist, we got to wait and see. There's certainly some things that look fascist, there's tendencies. He's clearly got a base of people who are fascists. Usually all of them are white ethno-state people, but he's got to meet certain criteria, and then when the criteria were met, I was like, there he is, he's a fascist. And I think we have to be very careful about the use of neoliberal. You use it enough and it doesn't mean anything after a while. It's sort of like a conversation that I had today on Twitter where somebody was using the Panopticon concept, and I was like, that doesn't really apply here, and there's better concepts that fit this particular thing that we're talking about. And he's like, well, but it has some traits in common. And I was like, okay, everything has traits in common with everything else. You want to be very clear in the concepts that you're using, because otherwise everything just turns into one unanalyzable blob, right? So... all right. Let's see what else we've got. There's a lot of side conversation here. Dennis E. Paul, don't forget about whack job movements that ate up the whole Russia collusion hoax. Yeah, I mean, sure, there's you can find crazy stuff like that on the left. They aren't actually getting guns and trying to, break in and hang people and kill people. And so if you want to do some whataboutism with that, or some don't forget about, you always have to do it in proportion. The Russia collusion thing was, it was sort of a waste of time. That's granted. Clearly, Russia did interfere in our election, just not in exactly the same way as the collusion people were saying. I think that there's other stuff that's probably more important to worry about right now than that, right? Barklord, the way I understand the Washington consensus is that there's no alternative to market ideology as a so-called neutral ideology. I don't know that anybody thinks the markets are neutral. They usually, when they're talking about it, I think, have in the back of their mind that their favored corporations or donors or whatever they have stock in is going to do quite well. It's better to say that it's not that it's neutral, it's that it is the dominant ideology, and it has become so in part because of centrist third wave Democrats. The market, this let's always have market solutions is a stupid approach to things. Anybody who's like the market is always the best thing is just, they're lazy. They haven't actually looked at the history of how these things work, and they don't differentiate. There are some things that might benefit from privatization. There are some things where it might be good to go to contractors, right? There's other things where it's a terrible idea, and we need to be able to differentiate instead of being pro-market, anti-market, pro-market, anti-market. That's not particularly helpful. But you are right that most of the people in Congress on the Republican and Democrat side are typically going to be, pro-market, whatever that happens to mean for them. And it's in part because of how much corporations are able to intervene in our political process. You know, that's a significant part of it. So, all right, let's see what else we have. Ross Whitlock, the GOP is dead to me. So that's an interesting thing. You know, I've voted Republican in the past. I've actually been a registered Republican when I lived in New York, because I wanted to be able to, like, you know, vote in primaries, and they don't have open primaries like you know, smart states do, like Wisconsin does, which is much more democratic. And I didn't want to vote in elections where basically the fix was already in. I wanted to be able to vote for something that mattered. And, you know, in the past, I've been supportive of the Republican Party against the Democrat Party, but the current iteration of the Republican Party is at this point in such a mess. Like I was saying earlier, that unless they, you know, they could have a come to Jesus moment and really start sorting things out. There's the danger right now. Trump is actually talking about, you know, going off and forming a third party. That actually would be a good thing, I think, for the Republican Party. It would not be a good thing short term, but it would allow them to get rid of a lot of the problematic elements of their party. They would lose elections for a while, but they would be a better party for it, and they would come out of it, and they could start re-articulating the values that they want without being as beholden to noxious interests as they have been. I don't really think that's going to happen, unfortunately. I think the Republican Party is going to continue on through. Demographically, you look at the you know, exit polls and stuff like that, the Republican Party, even with gerrymandering, even with voter suppression, even with all these other things that they routinely do, which are against the common good and against, you know, any sort of, you know, notion of democracy, and it essentially is anti-American. They're not gonna have a viable base in another 20, 30 years. So they really have to, not to put a fine point on it, either get their shit together or relegate themselves to being a lunatic fringe, and get used to democratic domination, sort of like during the New Deal period. You know, if a party doesn't really have something to offer except to the people who are funneling money into it or getting an emotional charge out of it or tying their identity into it, it's not going to be a viable party in a healthy democracy for very long. And so, you know, that's a serious issue. All right, Zeno, destroying the statues probably is a pure shame. They'll go for the history textbooks next. A lot of the history textbooks are shit. So, you know, we probably should get rid of half the history textbooks that are out there. And, you know, I'll tell you, when it comes to statues, I love the statue that we have for our Civil War people here in Milwaukee, because it shows, and I've posted this in various places, it shows three Union soldiers trampling over the bodies of rebels. That's our tradition here in Wisconsin, by the way. Killing rebels, killing Confederates, killing racists, killing seditionists. And so if that's what you mean by statues, I'm all for that. I think we need more of those. You know, I think we should show statues of war criminals being hung. That would be awesome. You know, things celebrating a bullshit history that's been whitewashed so that, you know, people can feel good about the waving a rebel flag. Not into that, you know. So you're not going to find me a receptive person to this statues argument. All right, let's see. Another view: limited hangout controlling thoughts. If you think this is controlling your thoughts, man, you're badly off. All right. Barklord, my family are conservative libertarians who talk tough and will not negotiate with democratic process, complete proprietarian, authoritarian. Sorry to hear that. You know, we got to figure out what we're going to do with those people. Ross Whitlock, I hate both parties. They're all terrible. I hate both parties too. I hate the fact that pretty much anybody who makes it into politics uses it to, make themselves richer and put their kids in better schools, and they become part of a political class. A process, by the way, which Rousseau talks about in the discourse on the origins of inequality. Once you've got political power, the money and the prestige will follow. That said, should we say they're all terrible? No, that's a silly point of view. And what we should do is we should say how terrible they are. Some are more terrible than others. And we've got to work with the options that we have. That is one of the key things that, again, Aristotle, Arendt, Habermas, all sorts of other people. Politics is about doing what you actually can within the framework that you can to try to achieve some things that are good and get other people who don't agree with you to go along with it. So simply throwing our hands up in the air and saying, oh, it's all terrible, that's not going to get anything done, and we can certainly call. Here's one thing that I will say that's good about what you're saying. We should be willing to call out both sides. This is the legitimate both sidesism when they are legitimately doing the wrong thing. So like, for example, Democrats who are, in charge of a city and in the pocket of police unions, we ought to go after them, right? That's a good idea. When there's corruption taking place, whoever's engaging in corruption ought to be called out on it. But this like it's all bad, that just doesn't really work for anything. Let's see what we got here. Wow, another view's got some weird stuff. Full loss and fee, junk fake philosophers that don't test their teachings. What is reality? That's some nice word salad there. But this probably isn't the place for you, I'm guessing, right? Where if you get to the point where you're like writing weird crap, because who knows, you need to say something, you're sort of like making yourself the person in the corner who has nothing to contribute to the conversation. Andrew, do you think more logical people are conservative and emotive people lean more left? No. As a matter of fact, I think that it is very well distributed across the board. I think if you look at the current right, most of the people that I see on the right are very driven by emotional needs and desires. Some of the great motifs, like think about the incredible passion that people show about their guns. Is that based on anything that's rational and logical? No. And you can go through their decision-making process. I can look at some of the members of my family who've blown so much money on guns and blown so much of their time arguing with other people about the Second Amendment. That is driven by emotion. That is not driven by, facts, logic, any of the things that they like to appeal to. So no. All right, let's see what else we've got here. Moonchild, here's somebody new. What do you think of some Democrats saying unity means that we can disagree, but violence should not be our way of settling disputes since we're all Americans? If that's what you mean by unity, I'm cool with that, and I think that should actually be a baseline. Once you cross the line into violent insurrection, you should get locked up and have whatever weapons you have confiscated, and whatever funds have been, used to promote you, that should be confiscated as well. Turn to the public good. We could create all sorts of cool accounts for that sort of thing. There are some certain lines that you shouldn't be able to cross, that were crossed. And they were crossed, by the way, again, think about the invasion of the state houses by heavily armed people who call themselves protesters. From where I sit, the minute you go to a protest and you've got any sort of, long rifle or you're in military gear, you're not a protester, you're a terrorist, because you're trying to inspire terror in other people, and you're trying to shut other people down. And if you're doing that in the state house to try to, change, policy or something like that, you are in effect using the threat of force, violent force, against the common good and those who are supposed to be in charge. So I'm cool with that definition. Goddardammerung, Twilight of the Gods says, is it unreasonable to adopt a normative theory if you're undecided on the anti-realism versus realism debates in meta-ethics? No. As a matter of fact, everyone has a normative theory. Even the meta-ethics people have normative theories. If you're an emotivist, you also have a normative theory. I don't believe in the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics. I think it breaks down very quickly in practice. And I think everybody actually operates, perhaps inconsistently, with some sort of identifiable moral theory. So it's not only not unreasonable to adopt a normative theory, it's also inevitable to do so. All right. Let's see here. Just skipped a little bit. A lot of back and forth about market ideology, which we've talked about a good bit already. Zeno Valea, what do you think about Twitter banning the new Bret Weinstein party idea? I don't know the new Bret Weinstein party idea, so I really can't say anything about it. I will say about Twitter banning, people have been banned on Twitter for a long time. I don't have a problem with people getting banned on Twitter. Violate the rules, they should ban you. As a matter of fact, Trump should have been kicked off of Twitter a long time ago, but they bent over backwards for him and his supporters and kind of hoard themselves out in the process. I think, if we have rules, we should apply them. And I think that, if you want to bitch and whine about being canceled or being deplatformed, go somewhere else. If you're on TV complaining about your Twitter account being closed, you haven't been censored. As a matter of fact, you're spouting stuff about it right then, right? So I don't know enough about that particular thing to say, but I can say that most of what people say about cancel culture or the dangers of big tech censoring people is really just self-serving bullshit. They didn't complain about it when it was people that they disagreed with getting banned. Sometimes they actually celebrated that. There's not much more to say about that. We could probably do a show about that, though. All right, more back and forth. That's a little bit hard to decipher. Jay Hitchcock says, I live in Texas. For some people here, guns are at the level of a fetish. They are in a lot of Wisconsin, too. And, that's a good way to put it. They're, going back to like the emotional versus rational thing, fetishes are not rationally thought out. It's because somebody's got deep set anxiety, fears, resentments, anger that they fixate, or desires that they fixate on certain things that they have to have, and those must be protected. And it can be part of a person's identity, I'll say this: if having a gun, and I say this as somebody who grew up in a neighborhood full of guns, where we actually had a juvenile prison just across the highway from us. Every once in a while, a prisoner would break out, and we'd see people walking around the street armed, with shotguns and pistols and rifles. And I come from a family that hunts, and some of them collect guns. The need to have a gun as part of your identity is really sad and pathetic. One should be able to build an identity without that. And you could say the same thing with martial arts guys back in the 80s, if you had to have a pair of nunchucks, right? Now it's other stuff, right? It's just kind of, it's like a sign of being stunted in many ways, unfortunately. All right. So Kent says, historical woke hordes canceling people not at all driven by emotions. Great point, Sadler. That's a dumb comment. Who said that that's not driven by emotion? You read so much stuff in, it's like you're primed to find fault, right? But there aren't historical woke hordes canceling people. Most of that is a bullshit fake narrative that serves other people's emotions. So, all right. Ian France, philosopher Charles Taylor, wrote a good book 30 years ago called The Malaise of Modernity. He points towards the instrumental reason of the state deciding everything in terms of efficiency. Yeah, I mean, this is a long-standing thing. Max Weber wrote about this. Alistair McIntyre talks about that in a number of different places. It's not like a radically new point. I don't know that those analyses are really that helpful for what's going on in the present in terms of like our electoral politics, but they could be interesting to talk about our larger politics. And they can also be transferred from the sort of political sphere into the economic sphere as well. All right. Ian Franz follows up with, I believe much of the unrest is sideways explosion of feeling people have from being squashed and losing their voice in the body politic. Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. Certainly the Black Lives Matter stuff, that's legitimately a center of it. And then seeing the police responses to Black Lives Matter as just doing more of the same police stuff, which they don't get, they don't get held accountable for. I would say that fits into that. I'm again, coming from the Midwest and having lived all over the place and having people in my family who work in the trades and coming from kind of a blue collar background, the narrative of like the typical Trump voter that you meet in the diner as having being upset about their economic dislocations and not being taken seriously. I think that's at best half true. I think that a lot of the people who supported the Trump administration actually are making good money. We see that in a lot of cases. I would say that there's quite a few people who have been, sort of like squashed and economically dislocated, and then they reach out for racist or sexist or whatever explanations because they were racist or sexist to begin with. And they were just doing good for a while, and then things went badly. All right. Corey asks, any thoughts on respecting local resolutions instead of allowing a genocide to happen to individuals on Social Security? Not sure what the genocide means. Oh, older people dying off, right? Thoughts on respecting local resolutions. I don't know how that connects with local security or with Social Security. Social Security is a federal program. So, although, states like Illinois have their own retirement system that's outside of Social Security, but unfortunately the state often raids that fund, which is a big problem, right? So I don't know how to answer that. All right. Paul says the Keystone XL project offered opportunity for America to come together, union jobs, strong environmental controls while supporting energy industry. Awesome talking points. I'd love to see the site that you took those from, but unfortunately you left out a lot of the important stuff as well that makes it controversial. So all you're doing there is giving some talking points. All right, let's see who else we've got. And I do have to end this a little bit earlier than I usually do because we got the Packers game coming up and I've got some grading I have to do. All right. Joshua asks, what do you think Nietzsche would say about our political environment? Well, he'd say that it's, sign of like how screwed up things are in modernity, and he wouldn't like the Democrats and he wouldn't like the Republicans either, and he wouldn't like their bases. I think he'd kind of throw his hands up and he'd say this is a time to cultivate solitude. All right. A lot of back and forth stuff. Elian, isn't the gun a fetish of freedom? Well, there's a lot of different ways of understanding freedom. It wouldn't be a fetish of freedom. It could be a symbol of freedom, but it's a pretty sad symbol of freedom, given all the other possibilities that are out there, and given the fact that, you know, guns are for killing, guns are for shooting. That's their purpose. That or intimidating people. So you can say, well, it's for self-defense. Yeah, self-defense by intimidating and shooting, right? I mean, you know what I have for self-defense? I don't, you know, need a gun, but if I go into a rough place, I carry a spring-loaded baton, you know, because that sound is way more satisfying than the click click that people are always doing in every show about, you know, cocking a gun or something like that. You know, guns are, well, we got to say a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to keep going on and on about this. Ken says the people excuse people being banned, say go somewhere else, then they get service providers to take down the independent sites people go to. Utter hypocrisy. Yeah, I mean, that's probably happened in some cases. I've never actually seen a case where somebody is totally unable to find a platform to be on. But if you know, if that you think that happens, it'd be cool for you to write a long form essay about the case in which that happened. Hitchcock says, I'm not anti-gun. I'm simply for reasonable regulations and safety measures like the NRA used to stand for. Yeah, before the NRA turned into a bunch of nutters. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of, I'm actually with you on that. We do have a lot of gun laws, and if they were strictly enforced and followed, that would curb an awful lot. Unfortunately, they're often not, right? And there's a lot of selective enforcement. So that's a bit of an issue. Sean says, if there was genuine election fraud, I know there was not, but suppose there was that widespread, would the Capitol storming be justified? So if there was widespread election fraud that actually took place and could be demonstrated, then you could go through the courts. So no, storming the Capitol would definitely not be justified. And there was some election fraud. There's always going to be some election fraud. The question is how much of it. So it wasn't enough to actually make a difference, except in crazy, whacked out conspiracy theories, right? All right. Let's see here. Julian, thoughts about the debate about whether we should call the Capitol building protesters terrorists, like if they are labeled terrorists, BLM protesters were by also extension terrorists. If BLM protesters were actually bringing weapons and which for the most part they didn't, certainly not here much in Milwaukee, you know, one of the most segregated large cities in the United States, where we had BLM protests go past our place routinely, and where I watched quite a few of the parades. You know who was armed? Boogaloo boys, cops. So you got to think this through before you try to make these equivalencies. And yeah, should the Capitol building protesters be labeled terrorists? Every single one of them who used violence or threatened violence was a terrorist. They wanted to inflict terror. Some of them wanted to kill people. They were doing so motivated by, you know, extremist views. The notion that you should invade the Capitol to disrupt elections, that's an extremist view. So yeah, there's no problem calling them terrorists. All right, let's see who else we got here. I haven't taken anything from so far. Nausea asks an interesting question here. Do you think we should be giving a political platform to people who are overtly false, such as the QAnons, the Trumpists, or the people who raided the Capitol building? We can frame this in a lot of different ways. So what does it mean to give a political platform? Can they participate in politics? Yes. If they engage in crime that, you know, is directed against the political process, maybe they should lose some of their rights, you know. Should they be accorded a place in the media? Responsible media stuff would actually say, some of these people are clearly too far out there. We shouldn't be covering them, let alone giving them a platform. They've already got their own preferred platforms to be on, some of which, like Fox News, aren't extremist enough for them at this point, so they go after Fox. And then there should be what Mill and Bentham call the social sanction. If somebody is, I have no problem with saying, to somebody who's like a QAnon believer, well, you're full of shit, and I'm not going to listen to anything that you have to say until you repudiate that crazy crap. And I'm perfectly fine with other people doing that. I think it's actually doing a social service to call people on bullshit like that. That is sort of that was at one time sort of a mainstream view, right? Joshua asks, do you think the death of God Nietzsche concept had happened or will happen in America? I think according to Nietzsche, it happened a long time ago, right? So there's actually a really great book out there by Samuel Harrington that was written in the 1980s called The Politics at God's Funeral. He was a Marxist who took Nietzsche seriously, this death of God, meaning, about the framework within society and like the devaluation, not just of theology, but philosophy, science, those sorts of things. And he said, well, who actually benefits from this? How does this actually work out? So, all right. Kant Jensen says, comments are limited to a few characters. I think a philosopher should show good faith, try to understand the point he's trying to make before calling it a dumb comment. Old fan disappointed. That's a dumb comment. But it's cool that you want to tell me exactly how I should do things on my channel. And it's too bad you're disappointed. This is what it is. And there are some views that are really dumb. There are some questions that people ask in the classroom that are dumb. And, you can do a video or do a podcast or write a thing about what you think a philosopher ought to be and see if you can get other people to buy into it. All right, let's draw this to a close and see what else we've got that we can kind of go out on. Ian says about the death of God parable was written by Nietzsche in the context that it's already occurred, but the news has yet to reach us. Yes, but that was news over 100 years ago. So, presumably it would have reached us by now, right? Let's see here. Hitchcock says it was the same here in Texas. BLM protesters weren't armed, counter protesters were. Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of things. We really need to address that. If the BLM protesters were regularly armed, you can bet that there would have been like National Guard shooting them, which they didn't do with white supremacists. So, all right. A lot of back and forth. Let's see if we've got a good thing to go out on. Some book recommendations in here as well. Okay, so here's a good sort of very, very broad question by Joseph March. Why does authoritarianism seem appealing to many people? That's kind of a constant, I think, across cultures, across times. There's always been this undercurrent going on. And, authoritarianism of various sorts can be appealing for people who, like Rousseau has pointed out, they're willing to accept somebody having power over them so long as they can kick somebody else, so they can have power over somebody else. I think that's a big part of it, what we often call the politics and culture of resentment. By the way, I would recommend reading Nietzsche and reading Max Scheler on ressentiment. So Genealogy of Morals, Beyond Good and Evil for Nietzsche, good places to go to, and Max Scheler's book, Ressentiment. And you'll see a lot of stuff in there that like kind of shows you where some of the authoritarian impulses come from. I think a lot of people like authoritarianism because they're driven by fear, and they think that other people are violating the rules, the norms. We gotta put all this in order. And their order always ends up being something, to go back to Augustine, it always winds up being something kind of unhealthy, kind of distorted. It's order in a sense, but it's not really order. It winds up being a kind of covert disorder. Bad laws creep in, which Augustine says aren't really laws at all sorts of hierarchies that are what Augustine calls the human law, or the temporal law, which is often quite damaged and doesn't map on to what he calls the eternal law. There's other things as well, sometimes people are so traumatized that they gravitate towards whoever can make them feel like they're somehow whole. They identify with the political figure or the cultural figure, and they'll do whatever that person has to say. But authoritarianism by itself, as a broad category, is almost never rooted in something good, but it draws upon things that are positively good. Like, again, think about Augustine. Order is a good, right? We do have to have order within society. Do we have to have it in this particular mode where order means clamping down as much as possible on people and ruling out a lot of genuine developments and enjoyments of goods, including the development of human persons? No, but that's what some people are cool with, so long as we can have, so long as we can have that feeling of order, right? So actually, that's a good thing to close on. Augustine says that evil is always an absence or corruption or perversion of the good. And that is really the case. The good things that we have, this is why politics is always messy, the good things that we have, none of them are absolutely, purely, unequivocally good. To use the example of a gun could be good when it's being used to hunt food for your family or to protect you from marauders, right? Or I suppose you could use it for other purposes, but it's so easy for it to be turned to evil. And there's so many things that can go wrong with it. So I'm going to close on that. Thanks for all the questions and comments, even the ones that were kind of off base or carping at each other. There's a lot of arguments back and forth in here. We'll do this like every other month. We next month, I'm not sure what the topic will be, but we'll find something. And you can find this on the Reason.io calendar and in my Facebook events. You can also find it talked about in my monthly update videos, which I know some of you watch. So, all right, going to end it here.